A fateful day. In just 32 minutes, it will be exactly 40 years since one of the most destructive natural disasters in our state's history. On this day back in 1980 at 8:32 in the morning, Mount St. Helens erupted. It would quickly become the deadliest volcanic eruption in U.S. history, killing 57 people and causing $1 billion in damage. This morning, 40 years ago later, we are looking at Mount St. Helens. The top 1,400 feet of what was the mountain is no longer there. It was completely blown off. And right after that eruption 40 years ago, you really wouldn't have seen much. That's because ash spewed 10 miles into the air and it blanketed the Northwest, stretching to 11 states and Canada. Good morning and welcome to this special edition of King 5 Mornings, Mount St. Helens 40 years later. I'm Mimi Jung.
And I'm Jake Wittenberg. This morning we are going to look back at that fateful day 40 years ago this morning. And right in here at the bottom of your screen, we have a countdown clock to the exact moment when Mount St. Helens erupted back in 1980. And we have team coverage of what happened then and the 4 decades since with our Rich Marriott, who was just on the mountain just before the rumbling began. He has a great story to tell. Glenn Farley and Michael Crow also rounding out our coverage this morning. We'll also have a look at what the mountain looks like today and how coronavirus is impacting a key institute up at Mount St. Helens this morning.
King 5 News was extensively involved in all of the coverage leading up to the eruption and everything after. Our Glenn Farley takes a look back at our coverage before and after that fateful day.
King 5 journalists were deeply involved in the Mount St. Helens story, from the build-up to the eruption, the day of the eruption, and the aftermath. And it was all summed up in this definitive documentary.
No magma has yet come to the surface, but this means that it is heating up, and so magma conceivably is rising. In combination with the seismic precursors we've seen, it looks like there's a very good chance that there will be an eruption.
The geologists knew it was coming, something, but no one expected what happened at 8:32 Sunday morning, May 18th, 1980. The mountain blew up.
The scale of it all was simply astounding. It was a human disaster. An early count placed the dead at 25, with 40 missing. Far more needed evacuation. Rescuers quickly became heroes.
Dad, do you want to go to Bob?
These were the folks that survived the blast, but they weren't out of danger. The mud was coming.
Would you get off the bridge?
Come on, get over here!
The snow and glaciers on top of the mountain melted, combined with the ash to form dreaded lahars, mud flows that would extend this disaster miles and miles away from the mountain itself. The world turned black and white, even on color film. Lahars would tear through logging camps, leading to flooding, sweeping away homes.
I'd made up my mind I was going to make it. But the wife and my friend wanted to give up, and I couldn't turn it. Just, I don't know. It's hard for me to even realize what has happened.
And it wasn't over.
The mushroom cloud of ash and black smoke soared 10 miles above the Cascades. In the cities east of the mountain, the sun was snuffed out as ash fell like snow.
But even as many found rescue, the disaster was far from over.
Dawn on Monday broke like the first day on a strange new planet. Up the Toutle River Valley, the destruction was complete.
40 years ago, they wore masks too, but for a different reason. For much of the state, ash was everywhere.
Oh, it ain't bad out here. It ain't good either.
The ash had to be shoveled like snow. It wasn't going to melt.
Part of the house is still standing, and we left with the shirts on our back. I'd like to get back in.
It was as scary gets, because you didn't know what was coming out of the sky. You couldn't see. It was hard to breathe. The kids were crying, saying, "Daddy, are we going to be all right?"
The mud now stopped, set like wet concrete. President Jimmy Carter came to see for himself.
Somebody said it looked like a moonscape, but the moon looks like a golf course compared to what's up there.
And still the mountain boiled. It would erupt twice again in the next month, showering ash over Portland and Olympia, Washington. But this eruption, this blast, the equal of a 50 megaton bomb, was the most dramatic in at least 500 years.
There are 5 volcanoes in Washington state. Mount St. Helens is just one of them. The question, when is the next eruption? At Mount St. Helens, Glenn Farley, King 5 News.
We have the entire 30-plus minute documentary Glenn just showed us on our YouTube page. For a link to it, you can text the word Helens to 206-448-4545.
Our meteorologist, Rich Marriott, joining us now. Rich, you were a big part of everything leading up to the event. You were, of course, around when all this happened. Take us back to the moments before. You were a meteorologist for the U.S. Forest Service Avalanche Center, and you were on the mountain before all this happened. Take us back to that day.
Yeah, well, actually, quite a while before it happened, Jake, because that winter the Forest Service was looking at increasing the cross-country skiing around Spirit Lake and maybe developing more trails there. And so they asked us to come in that winter and evaluate what the avalanche danger is going to be and look more closely at the weather forecast for it, because that's what we did. We worked out of the National Weather Service office. And it was a really popular place. Take a look back. This picture was taken the fall before, not in 78 actually, but I mean, it was just such a spectacular place. It was so beautiful, and so people were easily drawn to it. It was a bit of a haul to get there, but just was a gorgeous place, and especially in the wintertime, it was perfect for cross-country skiing. They'd already started to lay in some tracks just to kind of test it out, and so we had already been there through much of the winter, off and on, going down and checking things out. This is Chuck Ton, who was the snow ranger for the Forest Service, then checking out Spirit Lake itself for skiing. We put in the snow study plot that was there. We also put in more weather instruments and hired a weather observer for that winter who was down there in Spirit Lake. She actually lived next door to Harry Truman, and she was taking weather observations. We kind of build up some background history on what it was like there. So this all led up to the March 16th. I'm the furthest one on the left. My partner in the Avalanche Center is Mark Moore there in the blue. And so we were down there frequently during the winter, just checking out what was going on. When the first earthquakes occurred around March 16th, it shook the mountain, and as you might imagine, the snowpack on there, we started seeing avalanches in places you didn't ordinarily see avalanches. And so this is some pictures right after those first shakes took place. We saw more of this. So part of our job was to forecast both the weather and also the avalanche danger for the scientists working inside of the red zone. You can see we worked pretty close to where the mountain was, and we continued to monitor the situation, and both within the snowpack and watching that bulge build on the north side of the mountain. We became concerned enough when we got up to about the first part of May that we started to worry about our observer there in Spirit Lake, and we actually went in and decided on the 8th of May that we had to take her out. This is kind of like what it looked like at that point. The snow had become quite dirty from the ash coming out of the mountain. So we went back to her and went and took her out of out of the Spirit Lake Lodge area there. It's an older shot from there when it was much snowier. And so we picked her up, and we decided she wanted to go up and make one last look at the mountain. So we went up the top of the Timberline Loop Road and sat there and watched the sunset on the mountain there. This was on the 8th of May. Went back down, and she wanted to say goodbye to Harry Truman. So we got to go over and spend about an hour and a half with Harry Truman and meet all of his cats that he kept. And we also we were asking about, well, aren't you concerned about the mountain coming down? He had no concerns. I mean, he was a cantankerous guy for sure. And he said there was a cave. He had a cave on the other side of the lake. They had supplies in there, and he had a speedboat. And if it started to erupt, he was going to jump in the speedboat, go across the lake. And he said he was good for a month there with the supplies. Obviously, he didn't make it, but it was an interesting experience. And then 10 days later, there was a huge explosion, which actually I was at home in Greenwood when that happened. And then I went back down, and I was in on the rescue flights. sites and got to see firsthand the transformation of that area from this beautiful, pristine wilderness to this gorgeous, to this just moonscape. So we'll take a look at that coming up in our next half hour. Jake?
Yeah, such an interesting story. I love hearing your Harry Truman story. Rich, thank you. We'll hear more about Harry in the next half hour. And all morning long, we're going to look back on this 40 years since the eruption with the help of you at home. Well, a lot of memories coming in this morning, like this one from Sean Austin, who wrote to us and said, here's a photo of a state trooper not long after the eruption, all covered in dust. Seeing a lot of photos from Central Washington as well. This one more recent from just a few days ago, actually, May 9th. Thanks to Greg Snyder, who sent this photo from Elk Rock Viewpoint, one of the few spots you can see the inside there of the volcano. Also, one more from Jane Dilbeck, sweat, ash on a car in Moses Lake. These are just a few of the many memories we've been getting from you all morning and all week. You can send in your photos anytime to our Facebook page. Thousands of you have already joined in. We'll continue to share them on air. Meme?
Well, right now we are only about 21 minutes until 8:32, which is the exact time the mountain erupted 40 years ago. Coming up next, you'll learn about a man who was on Mount St. Helens to warn the rest of us.
David said, we're essentially sitting next to a keg of dynamite. He said the fuse is lit, but we don't know how long that fuse is.
We'll tell you about the scientist who told the world what was happening the day of the eruption. We'll be right back. This morning, we are remembering those who lost their lives when Mount St. Helens erupted 40 years ago. Right now, you'll learn about a man who was on the mountain to warn the rest of us. King 5's Glenn Farley talks to two people who knew him well and one who used to work right here at King 5.
The pictures can only suggest the power of that eruption captured on a clear, sunny Sunday morning of May 18, 1980. The top 1,400 feet of the mountain blown off. That explosion prompting perhaps the most famous last words said in the Pacific Northwest. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. This is the man who said those words, trying to provide the warning to the rest of us 40 years ago. David Johnston, scientist.
David and I were standing on a mountain ridge doing an interview, and David said, we're essentially sitting next to a keg of dynamite. He said the fuse is lit, but we don't know how long that fuse is.
Jeff Renner retired 4 years ago as King 5's meteorologist, but in 1980 he was the station's science reporter, reporting live from St. Helens, even from the inside of a camper.
It's because the weather here is so very stormy.
Located in what would become known as the blast zone on the north side of Mount St. Helens. He had met Johnston 2 years earlier.
If we were to stand here when that went off, we would surely die. Well, he was right.
Well, obviously we didn't know ultimately what would happen. We knew it was a very hazardous place. In fact, we had a station at Spirit Lake that had to be serviced every 5 days, and we knew that was too dangerous.
Steve Malone is now a professor emeritus at the University of Washington. At one point, Johnston was his student.
This is a gravity meter.
This is Malone 40 years ago, his hair darker. He's a seismologist studying earthquakes. Johnston specialized in volcanoes. Earthquakes are precursors to eruptions, and the two remain connected during the emergency. For months, thousands of small quakes had shaken the ground under Mount St. Helens, indicating molten rock was on the move.
There's all these earthquakes going on.
As the ground trembled, as the north side of the mountain bulged out, as property owners hung out at roadblocks, allowed to check on their cabins and homes just a day before the eruption. What nobody knew was the trigger point, and everybody was tired of waiting. Renner, photographer Mark Anderson, and engineer Mike Carter came home on Thursday for good reason. It was Carter's wedding anniversary. Had you stayed, what would have happened?
I wouldn't be talking to you today. We were camped, I believe the name of the small ridge or knob, as it were, was Spud Mountain. And it was directly within the blast zone to the north of the volcano. We first started out camping in a camper trailer, and then we moved into a tent so that we could get even closer.
On Friday, Malone flew over a camper where David Johnston was staying to monitor the mountain for signs of trouble.
I was installing 2 stations on May 16th, one at Elk Rock to the west, and another one at a site called SOS just near Timberline. And flying in the helicopter across there, I could look over and see the camper that was up on Coldwater Ridge.
There may also be some changes in the roadblocks in this area, at least if local merchants have their say.
Another trip for cabin owners was planned for Sunday morning. Renner says had the eruption come an hour later, instead of 57 dead, it could have been hundreds. The eruption began at 8:32 in the morning. Did you think of David that morning?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Very early on, when I heard how big it was, that was one of the first thoughts, not knowing. And then probably late in the morning when the word was coming in that the devastation area was huge, it started to sink in.
David Johnston was literally blasted off the mountain ridge that he was on, and his body was never found.
Renner and the King team flew back to their old camping site to find this Datsun B210, the driver still at the wheel.
And I asked our helicopter pilot, Bob Wright, to set us down. I just needed for a sense of closure to see what had happened to this person. And all I'll say is that if you had experienced the heat of that blast, it was not a pleasant sight, but it firmly implanted in my mind to this day how close I came, how close Mark came, how close Mike Carter came. And the fact that we didn't told me that I had to make good advantage. I had to take good advantage of the time that was given to me. Because that was, I view that as a gift. Not everybody got that day.
You could feel the palpable despondency, the sadness, we weren't able to do what we hoped we could do by anticipating hours or a day ahead, something big.
Johnston was heard over the radio that Sunday morning, alerting his colleagues in the final seconds of his life. Vancouver, this is it.
Oh, the story just gives me chills. King 5's Glenn Farley joining us now live this morning. And Glenn, you have reported on this for decades. We've had many conversations about it. Earthquakes were a key indicator something was going to happen, right?
Yeah, and the thing about it, when we talk about earthquakes as a safety type deal to prepare for, we're usually talking about something large, something that can shake your house, that can cause damage, things like that. But the key indicator here in these volcanoes are these little, often itty-bitty sub-magnitude 1 earthquakes that they start to pick up on deep underground, and that's what tells you that something is starting to stir. We saw that again when there was another eruption that started in 2004, what's called a dome building eruption. We saw not just a few of these earthquakes, but it just build up into thousands and then tens of thousands of these really small events.
And this blast changed the way that we look at active volcanoes forever. The equipment much different then than it is now. What did scientists have to work with back then?
Well, it was interesting in talking to Steve Malone, for example. He said, you know, the stuff we had back then was state of the art. Now, there wasn't the kind of monitoring on the volcanoes that there is now, because the Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver was not established then under the U.S. Geological Survey, but it is now. There is monitoring. That is something we're getting into at 6:30 tonight. But there is much better equipment, really, even since 2004.
Yeah, and also, Glenn, before you go, we've heard so much discussion about the Mount St. Helens bulge. Can you explain what that bulge is and why it was so significant?
I think there's we think about mountains, these kinds of volcanoes, just being solid rock, and the fact is they're not, from what the scientists say. It's really kind of a collection. It's almost like a garbage pile of ash and stone and stuff, and the north side of that was weaker. So as the magma was being forced into the mountain itself, that was the weakest part of it, and that started to push out as much as about 3 to 6 feet a day And that's the thing that they were watching very closely. And it was a 5.0 earthquake, again, not that big, but bigger than what they'd seen, that got that explosion and the debris avalanche and everything going.
Yeah, big enough. Glenn Farley, thank you so much for your work on this super interesting stuff on this somber anniversary. Thanks, Glenn.
At the bottom right-hand corner of your screen right now, we've got a countdown clock to the exact moment 40 years ago today when Mount St. Helens erupted. And here's a live look this morning at what the mountain looks like from Sky King. Coming up next, we'll talk with one King 5 News photographer who got an up-close view of the devastating eruption. A King 5 photographer camped out near Mount St. Helens for weeks before the eruption to bring viewers the latest photos and information. Mark Anderson joins us live now. And Mark, you've got an incredible story. I mean, you were right there at the mountain. You had left and gone home. So tell me your reaction when you found out that Mount St. Helens erupted and you were this close to being there.
Good morning, Mimi. Well, you know, the first thing is I was just totally amazed that it had happened. We knew something was going to happen, but to be gone away from the mountain when it did happen just was a very humbling experience for me.
We know that you were in a chopper for King 5 just hours after the eruption, and what you saw was pretty incredible. We will get back to you in our next half hour and hear more from you about that, because your story is just really, it just gives me chills. We're so glad that you're here to tell us this story. Stick around, we'll talk with you again coming up in our next half hour. Thanks, Mark. And still to come, it is just a few minutes away from 8:32. We are counting down to the very moment that Mount St. Helens erupted 40 years ago today. Stay with us, we'll be right back. You're looking at some of the only footage of the exact moment Mount St. Helens erupted 40 years ago today. It's short, it's grainy, but remember back then there weren't any cell phones or easy ways to record video, and no one really knew the exact moment the mountain might explode. Let's take you live to Sky King, and you can see what the area looks like today, that giant crater of Mount St. Helens. It's amazing after 40 years how much has grown back, how much life has come back, but the eruption still left its mark. And right now on the bottom right corner of your screen, you can see we've got a countdown clock to the exact moment when the eruption happened in 1980.
And maybe just under 2 minutes now until that fateful moment when all of it happened. And all morning we have had team coverage of what happened then and the 4 decades since with Rich Marriott, Glenn Farley, and our Michael Crow. And there's still more to come.
And as we wait for those last few moments, let's take a look back at what exactly led up to the disaster 40 years ago. Here's Vanessa Mashanya.
March 16th, 1980, 100 earthquakes are recorded in 1 week. This is considered the first sign of activity. 11 days later, a small burst of steam, the first in over 100 years. The following days until April 3rd, smaller eruptions begin to happen. Plumes of steam and ash explode out, reaching 20,000 feet into the air. April 8th, a series of explosions that lasted for 4 hours, the longest since the mountain had come back to life. Later that month, April 22nd, the eruption slowed down from about 1 per hour in March to about 1 per day. Small eruptions continued, as do the earthquakes, as we near May 18th. In this time, on the north flank of the mountain, a bulge begins forming, growing some 6 feet every day. We now know this was magma rising high into the volcano. Then on May 18th, 1980, a Sunday, at 8:32 a.m., a 5.1 magnitude quake strikes. The volcano erupts, causing a landslide and pushing out debris at over 300 miles per hour. Within 15 minutes of the eruption, smoke and ash rise 15 miles into the air. The eruption devastates an area of approximately 370 miles. In the inner zone of the eruption, which extends for about 6 miles, there are virtually no trees left, only scorched earth.
And we are now at that moment, maybe the exact minute on your clock, reaching that 40-year moment, 8:32 a.m. Pacific time, when Mount St. Helens erupted. On the left side of your screen here, you can see the eruption, that massive, massive landslide there that followed as well. And live Sky King up this morning, Mimi. And I just can't help but think as we hear all these stories from King 5 viewers in the past, those who worked, who were there at the time, just kind of gives you chills to think of the magnitude of this event. I mean, an event 500 times the energy of an atomic bomb. I mean, it's something 40 years ago then that still makes you, it just brings you chills today.
Yeah, so many people posting on our Facebook page their memories of that day. I was 4 years old, living in Puyallup at the time, really too young to remember anything that happened, but I asked some viewers on Facebook, you know, what do you remember? And people remember waking up and not hearing any birds outside. Some people looked out their windows and thought it was snowing because the ash was coming down, and other people felt you know, this small shake or shock or earthquake in their neighborhood. So many people remembering this day 40 years ago, and when you go back to Mount St. Helens and you stand there, you just can't believe what happens. It's so, the magnitude is so great. And one of the people that we always look to, who still works here at King 5, is Rich Marriott, who has his own experience of that day. And so, Rich, as we, you know, look back 40 years ago, it's hard to believe that it's been 40 years. You were working for the U.S. Forest Service Avalanche Center, and so you are very familiar with the mountain before the blast and, of course, after everything happened, and watching Mother Nature come back in places. The mountain will never be the same again, and that area, the devastation that happened, there's still that evidence of that, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely the evidence. In fact, I was talking to Jake about this yesterday, though it's tragic to see such a beautiful place transformed into a moonscape. To have the opportunity to watch that come back and see it be reborn and rebuild as we've seen over the last 40 years is really a gift. I mean, this isn't something a lot of people get to see, and we, living in the Northwest, we have gotten to see it. As I was talking about in the earlier segment, we had been down there during the winter looking at the area for the potential of putting in more cross-country ski trails. So we had already been down there taking observations and such. So fortunately, I wasn't there the day of the explosion, but we got called back. We worked in the Weather Service office, and a group of Weather Service people and I and Mark Moore, who was my partner at the Avalanche Center, went down to work on the rescue missions. They were looking for eyes, basically, to look out of the helicopters and look for survivors on search and rescue. Take a look at that group that came down from the Weather Service, so you can see the ash on the vehicles there coming down. You can see that it's a motley group for sure. This was, I think this was before we actually got into the helicopters and headed out. We ended up, you can see the Toutle Airport was just obviously with rescue helicopters. We were flying in a two-bladed Chinook. We had the rear door open, so we had more visibility, and everybody was crowded in there looking out the windows, looking for the possibility of finding survivors. First damage you saw was we flew up to Toutle that day, and this was about 4 days after the eruption, when the weather finally began to improve. It kind of tanked right after the eruption. We started to see the effects of the flooding, school buses trapped in there. Then we started to see the effects of the blast wave as we got closer. So the ash was everywhere as we got closer to the mountain. Trees down on cars, vehicles on the roads, just timber down forever. And keep in mind that I've been there 10 days before, 2 weeks before. It was looking, you know, it was just this pristine, beautiful forest that we had to look at, but it had been turned into a moonscape with fumaroles and steam vents. It was just an amazing time for sure. And there were still eruptions going on. In fact, our helicopter pilot had to dive behind a ridge one time when this one went off, because we didn't know exactly what the mountain wind was going to do. And then we were confronted by Spirit Lake, which was just totally covered in those logs. When we came back from that first mission, NBC had just come out. Chris Wallace, who worked for them at that point, came out, was looking for somebody who knew the area to fly with him, just to fly around for 2 hours and look at whatever we wanted. And I volunteered, and he chose me, and we took off. And here's a little clip from our flight that day, 4 days after the big explosion.
Really is something otherworldly.
It definitely is. I see something. I don't know if people have ever seen anything like this, possibly scientists in some remote area, but to be here in an area where a lot of people have spent time, where people have lived and worked, it's just amazing to see suddenly nature do this.
It was just, it was, when we were flying the rescue missions, we were flying a grid and we weren't supposed to go off them. This was a case where that looks interesting, you could fly there. Fortunately, we didn't find unfortunately we didn't find survivors, fortunately we didn't find any bodies, but it was an amazing time to be there and see this transformation. And it was otherworldly. Blocks of ice the size of houses laying on top of that. What was left of the glaciers that had been blown off the mountain. It was truly an amazing experience to see that transformation and to see the transformation in the last 40 years as we watched it all come back. Jake and Mimi?
Landslide. Unbelievable, Rich. I love hearing you tell the story, and I always love seeing that video of you all bearded up. As you said, a motley crew back in the day.
My other life.
Love chatting with you about that stuff. Yeah, thanks, buddy. All right, so also right now we want to bring in Mount St. Helens Institute's Executive Director, Ray Yurkovitz, this morning. Ray, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
All right, good. I can hear you too. So first this morning on this 40th anniversary, your thoughts about all that's happened since then and just the way that this changed the world forever in a lot of ways.
Well, it sure did. First, thanks for having me on this morning. I've worked at Mount St. Helens for 13 years, and of course, I wasn't there before 1980, but I think it's such an interesting place of both loss for many people, but also a landscape which is reborn in such a new way. And, you know, life is persistent. Life is resilient, and we've seen that since 1980. And the stories around the life that are returning continue to evolve over time. You know, we've seen mountain goats show up. There's about 400 mountain goats on Mount St. Helens now, and there were just a handful before the eruption. Of course, they were all eradicated during the eruption. There's just so many compelling stories. And, you know, this is a mountain that's erupted time and time again over the course of history. And, you know, like the college people know that. They've lived on the landscape for thousands of years. So it's just a landscape which it's hard to put some of these emotions together. The loss, the renewal, the scale of the place, both in terms of time as well as just the enormity of the volcano and of the crater. So it's really such a compelling landscape that draws people in and allows us to take away a connection to science, to the outdoors, the public land. It makes us ask questions and think critically. So I think it's a really important landscape in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I just love the way that you said that too, being reborn. That is so true. Real quick, I just want to also ask you about your fundraiser for the Institute over the weekend. You had Bill Nye the Science Guy and this virtual event. How did that go? Did you reach your fundraising goal?
You know, we did pretty well. It was great to spend some time with Bill. Yeah, he's always been a great supporter of Mount St. Helens and of the Institute. It was a lot of fun talking with him. You know, we just have some really significant challenges. All of our programming for pretty much the entire year has changed. Right? We can't do what we were doing before. We were really relying upon getting people up to Mount St. Helens to experience the landscape firsthand. There's no substitute for that. And of course, we can't do that, right? And who knows when we're going to be able to bring kids back up for outdoor school with their classes. It's unclear where we're going to be able to do that safely. So, you know, we've had to think about how to retool and how to evolve. And, you know, support from donors allows us to do that in the near term, but also really get through this. So on the other end of this, we can bring people back to Mount St. Helens and really experience all that it has to offer.
Yeah, I know that you do so many great things up there with the Mount St. Helens Institute. Another disaster had to get in the way, but we'll get us all back up there again. Ray Yurkovitz, thanks so much for being with us. We look forward to hearing from you throughout the day.
All right, take care. Thank you.
So many of you have shared your memories of the Mount St. Helens eruption with us on social media, and we would just want to share a few of them with you right now. Jackie Crow flew over the mountain on May 17th, 1980, so a day before the eruption. You can see in this photo the top is all intact. And then this photo from David Volz showing that he still has ash from the eruption in a jar. So continue sharing your memories with us, your photos or videos if you have them on our King 5 Facebook page. We'll be right back. We want to continue our conversation with King 5 photographer Mark Anderson now, who was the very first photographer to fly over the devastation after the Mount St. Helens eruption. So, Mark, in our last half hour, we heard from you about how you were at the mountain stationed there, covering it for weeks leading up to the eruption. You actually left and just narrowly missed being there at the time of the eruption. Then you got into a chopper, right, a helicopter, to fly over it, and you covered the aftermath of the eruption, you know, before we had cell phones and Wi-Fi signals. So tell us what it was like to cover such a huge event like that all the way back then.
Well, our normal way of communicating was with FM radios and landlines. All remember landlines. But as we flew down early that morning after the eruption, first thing that I saw was the Toutle River. All of a sudden, it was full of logs. And then as we continued on up the mountain, towards the mountain, all of this hot ash that had been deposited. So once we got to the ash area, as we continued on to towards the mountain, that's when we started to see all of this hot mud coming down, and it was something that shocked us all. Jeff and Bob, our pilot, I think we were all just amazed at the damage. It looked like you were on the moon. So. Then as we continued our survey, as we headed now back down away from the mountain, seeing the homes and the logging camp that had been destroyed and the bridge that had been torn apart, it was just truly, truly something that I never thought I would see.
Well, you guys had been covering the impending eruption. We knew that it was coming. Did you have any idea that it would look like this? The aftermath would be like this?
Oh, heavens, no. You know, Jeff and I were driving up, visiting with the geologists almost on a daily basis, and we saw the big bulge. You know, as I recall, the discussion was that they were concerned that the glacier would slip away and come down off the mountain, but nothing in terms of the cataclysmic explosion that happened.
And you were actually back home when the eruption happened. Share with us again just how close you came to actually being there, both you and Jeff, at the time.
Well, our engineer, Michael Carter, his wedding anniversary was that weekend, and he had called to the station to see if they could send another engineer down. Well, as fate would have it, our instruction was to come home after the 11 o'clock, see our families, resupply, and head back Monday morning. So we were so close. And flying over the car where we were parked and having seeing the gentleman deceased there was shocking.
Yeah. We heard Jeff describe that in our last half hour in the story that Glenn did. So it is surreal as we look at these images and videos, and I can't even imagine that those pictures and videos even capture what you were able to see with your own human eye. Mark Anderson, thank you very much for sharing your story with us. We really appreciate it. Jake?
We've heard many a story from Mark there in the news car over the years. He's such a great asset at King 5. Also, just a moment ago, again, we marked the 8:32 a.m. Pacific time anniversary, the exact moment when Mount St. Helens erupted 40 years ago today. Since the eruption, our own Glenn Farley has reported on the mountain extensively for decades, really. Glenn, let's talk a little bit about Mount St. Helens specifically. We see other volcanoes in the world sort of spewing lava, a little bit here, a little there. This was different than other volcanoes, right? Set the record straight.
Yes and no. I mean, Mount St. Helens is what's called a stratovolcano, as is Mount Rainier and the three other volcanoes, for a total of 5 in Washington State. You go further down, you can include Mount Hood into that as well, where Kilauea in Hawaii is a shield volcano. So the kind of action you got out of Mount St. Helens is typical for these kinds of volcanoes here in the Northwest and for much around the world, much around the Pacific Rim. Kilauea in Hawaii is a shield volcano. That's where you get this lava, this liquid lava that comes out. Our mountains basically explode, and that's what happened.
And Glenn, Helens is still an active volcano today, right? I mean, there was an eruption in 2004. There are still small earthquake swarms there today. Is this something that we're worried about?
It's always worrying. I mean, I think we would get enough warning when we see the small earthquakes and things like we did in 2004. And at one point, the Forest Service kind of pushed everybody back there. That became a greater area of concern. You got a lot of what's called phreatic explosions, where really you had water that would percolate down through the crater, and then when that would hit the magma that was coming up, the magma being superheated, it would explode. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network now at the University of Washington, they listen for those volcano earthquakes very closely, as they do at the Cascades Volcano Observatory in Vancouver, Washington. And again, you can see the PNSN map up right now. It's pretty quiet most of the time, but there are days when we will see a smattering of earthquakes around Mount Rainier, for example, and there's often earthquake activity around Mount St. Helens and under Mount St. Helens, but then they say you have to be able to tell the difference between an earthquake that is being caused by moving magma versus earthquakes, just because you have a lot of fractures and fissures and everything around there, and you get short movements in that land, and that can give you an earthquake as well. And the two are happening for different reasons.
Interesting. Story tonight at 6:30 about other active volcano dangers. Right? Tell us about that real quick.
So we're going to go back and look at just how well our volcanoes are being monitored. And know we have 5 volcanoes, and what people don't remember is that Mount Baker was actually thought that would erupt before Mount St. Helens. So starting in 1975, 1978, there was a lot of investigation. They did not have the earthquakes associated with that. They had a lot of steam coming out of the top of it. But there's not all that much monitoring there. Well, there was a lot of monitoring at St. Helens. We're going to get into all of that tonight.
Excellent. Glenn Farley with more interesting facts and figures about Mount St. Helens. Appreciate it, buddy. Thanks. Me?
As we head to break, here's another live look at Mount St. Helens from Sky King. Coming up, we will take a look back at some more of your memories of that day 40 years ago. We'll be right back.
Well, all morning long, as we look back 40 years since the eruption of Mount St. Helens, we also want you to share your memories with us so we can share them on air. We've got a lot of you submitting your Facebook comments to us and pictures. And before we pass the baton to our Dayside colleagues, we want to share a few more of those. Gail Pearson wrote and says she thinks it was her second climb to the crater rim in October of 2018 with her 2 sons after winning the climbing permit lottery. Also this one from Karen Jeffrey, who was living in Shelton and had to wear a face mask. This is her daughter showing ash on her mom's car. A lot of great stories out there, Meme.
Definitely, and we have extensive coverage on our website to tell you about. There's a link to take a virtual tour of the mountain, a timeline of the events leading up to the eruption, stories of people who studied the mountain before and after the explosion, and so much more. So you can text the keyword Helens to 206-448-4545, and we'll send you a link to our website. Don't forget to check out our YouTube page as well. We have our award-winning documentary on the mountain that King produced back in 1980. It's called The Mountain Erupts. The roughly 30-minute special is fascinating and shows video and moments that you may never have seen. Again, the entire thing is on our YouTube channel, and of course, our website has a link. So again, just text the word Helens to 206-448-4545. And we have coverage planned all day on the eruption anniversary. On King 5 News at 4, we'll talk with a woman by the name of Carmen Andrew. She shot amazing photos during a field trip back in 1980. Her memories of those moments right after the eruption. On King 5 News at 5, our environmental reporter Michael Crow gives us a look at how the present-day landscape, how it's changed and how life has returned to the mountain. And then at 6:30, Glenn Farley will join us with a look at other volcanoes in our state. to see if that destruction could happen once again in our future. Jake?
It is a big day, lots of coverage. 40 years ago. Have a great day, everybody.